Hello, welcome to another episode of No Franchise Fatigues, the good, the bad, the weird, the wild. The monthly segment where we pick out a cinematic figure and then choose 4 films from their filmography to analyze together. One for the good, one for the bad, one for the weird, and as you might have guessed it, one for the wild. I'm your host for the evening, Matt Reifschneider, and I'm sitting with my co-host, who, I had to drag away from a party in the basement of Big Ed and Nadine Hurley's. This is Sean Caylor. How are you doing this evening, my friend?
Quite well, and very, very excited to talk about the mind behind the people under the stairs. Boy, what do you think of Mr. Wes Craven?
I'm really excited to talk about Wes Craven today. I know we announced that we were talking about Wes Craven on our last episode, but I am excited particularly because Wes Craven has a really interesting filmography. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about these films. And I know when I was going through his filmography and I was rewatching a bunch of films in the last couple of weeks to kind of get back in tune with what he was doing and things like that, but I was actually having a really hard time picking only 4.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, very diverse filmography. Obviously best known as a horror director, but shockingly diverse when you actually start digging into it.
And he got shoehorned into a lot of horror, but he does a lot of mixture with horror, especially because I feel like he always wanted to be some kind of a comedic director because he's really funny, was really funny in real life. Rest in peace, Wes Craven.
I think Scream is masterfully funny, actually.
Yeah, he's got some great stuff, and I'm sure we'll be talking about some of the films today that incorporate a lot of his humor. But as a horror director, he did a lot of interesting things and mixed a lot of genres and started dabbling in a lot of things. He always had to make it horror because I think that's how he was able to get funding for a lot of his films. But
Yeah.
I'm excited to kind of talk and go through this. And like I said, I had a lot of problems kind of figuring out what my 4 films are going to be. But hopefully we don't cross over too much. We get to talk a lot about his different films.
Fair number of films, yeah.
Yeah. And I think before we get too far into this episode, there's an interesting tweet from Wes Craven before we even talk about kind of his background that I want to get your thoughts on, because he had a lot of great interviews that he would talk about, and he was pretty honest with a lot of the media about how he felt about things, which I really appreciate. But there was this quote that has always stuck with me, and this is something that I even like in high school, I would have this quote like written on notebooks and shit. So I really like this quote. But he said, "The first monster you have to scare the audience with is yourself." And I think that's a really interesting thing about him as a director, that he understood that he had to kind of maintain this image to be able to continue to thrive in the horror community. And I think that's really cool. But I don't know. What do you think about that quote?
I think in the face of one of my choices specifically, and we will get there, that's actually a fascinating context. And we'll get there when we get there, but I'm going to be honest, that actually really, really tracks with one of my films in particular.
All right. But in case for the listeners out there who may not know who Wes Craven is, I guess maybe we should give a little bit of a background on him.
So, born in 1939, a young Wesley Craven was first an English and humanities teacher in college, shooting 16 millimeter short films in his spare time until he decided to change careers, entering the lucrative world of pornographic film directing, albeit under pseudonyms. After releasing Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes in 72 and 77, however, he became associated with horror, which he never intended but did ultimately embrace.
Yeah. I mean, he's, as we said, has an interesting career, and it's interesting that his background came from something so different than a lot of these horror directors who usually come up, as wanting to be filmmakers, or, even if they don't want to be in horror, they kind of want to be filmmakers. So it's interesting that he had a completely different career before he even started jumping into film.
Yeah, and it's not always particularly shocking to have an English teacher, write a screenplay. Actually, in a way, it brought us Rambo, because Morrell was an English teacher who had a student who was a Vietnam vet, and that's what inspired First Blood initially. But I just think the kind of movies he ended up making, it's almost a mystery origin. Like it's shocking for him particularly, I think.
Yeah. And particularly because, as you said, like he kind of started off in some questionable genre work before he kind of got into horror. But it's interesting because he was, even in the early part of his career, he was known for being, a schlock director. Like he directed these shock movies and things like that. And he added a lot of artistry to it, I think, because of his background. He had an understanding. And what we're going over today for the listeners out there, the 4 films that we picked are based on him being a director, not as a writer or a producer or anything like that, just for
So
clarification's
very
sake.
solid credits in both of those as well.
Absolutely. And I think even as a writer, he has a tendency to be even maybe a little bit better at times. He can write some pretty smart stuff, and we'll be definitely getting into that here. One of the films that won't be included, for example, is Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, which is a film that he co-wrote, and it's an incredibly well-written film for essentially a third film in a franchise.
Dream Warriors makes really good argument for best of that franchise.
For sure, for sure. In fact, everything he touched in that franchise, it makes a bid for best of that franchise. So, but yeah, why don't we just kind of jump into that? And for our listeners out there, if you are, I mean, if you're interested in kind of making up your own list, we would definitely like to hear those. So you can send those our way. We would love to kind of see what you guys choose for the good, the bad, the weird, the wild. Because, like we said, he's got a. I mean, how many credits does he have under his name as a director? It's quite a few. 33. Ooh. I did not watch nearly that many. I should have tried to fit more in the last couple weeks. I did watch a couple that were fresh films that I had never seen before in the last couple weeks to prepare for this. So we'll see if we get to those today. But I don't know. Let's start off. Let's go into the good. So, Mr. Sean, what's your good?
So, an occasionally controversial choice, a movie excruciatingly ahead of its time and almost completely written off even within its own franchise. Wes Craven's New Nightmare had this brave, dead serious meta commentary on art, mental health, and horror. New Nightmare supposes that within the real world, Freddy Krueger is influencing events, implanting himself into the consciousness of the crew of a new Nightmare on Elm Street film to be born into the really real world. The movie uses this new concept for some really memorable kills and effect set pieces, most of which still hold up to this day. I cannot overstate my love for this movie.
New Nightmare. Bold choice, my friend. I mean, a good choice. I adore this film, but that's a bold choice.
I honestly and fully will stand behind this, believe that this is the best thing he has ever produced. And I wouldn't even call it, on the strength of one scene, but I think one scene illustrates why so well. And it's when Heather Langenkamp literally is running to him for help. And he has this moment where he's just telling her, look, I can't stop writing this movie. It's just in my head, and I'm being really, really compelled. And obviously, Freddy Krueger is not coming into the real world, and you are a crazy person. Do you need help? He's actually like very kind. He's like, you need help or whatever. But then it just slowly pans into his house and shows his word processor, because in those days that's what they were. And on the screen, scripted out, is exactly the conversation they just had. And it's this wonderful, creepy fourth wall moment that I think really resonates. And as I said, in a movie full of great scenes, that's just, I think, exemplifies what I love about the movie.
And I think a good point to be made about New Nightmare is that as much as people love to talk about Scream, and I'm sure we'll mention the Scream franchise here in a bit, but as much as people like to talk about how Scream created the meta narrative of reacting to itself as it was a movie, that New Nightmare actually does that. It refers to itself as a movie as it's happening. And you're right, it's a brilliant way to approach the material.
Well, because so often the use of breaking the fourth wall is relegated to comedy. And I've always been of the belief that comedy and horror, at the very least, are kissing cousins because they are dependent on the same setup and release format. unique to the two types of storytelling. They release in different ways, admittedly, but it's why comedy and horror tend to blend well. And he, I just think it's interesting in that, especially in that conversation, to have a movie that is metatextual and treats it deathly serious. It is not treated as a joke in any way, shape, or form. She's actually being she's in threat of losing her son because everyone's like, you are a crazy person, and she's like, no, you don't understand, this is happening to me, and it's really horrifying.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, that movie came out in 1994, late 19, like Halloween time, 1994. I remember when it came out. I was a big fan of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and got to be able to see that film, and it really kind of affects you because if you're a fan of that franchise, seeing Heather Langenkamp play herself,
Yeah.
you know, it kind of like it destroys that barrier,
Yeah.
for an audience too, and it makes it really kind of creepy in a lot of ways,
She
particularly.
it has those moments where she starts having the Freddy Krueger nightmares as a character. Then it has a very real thing of her appearing on Oprah, and Robert Englund comes out, but he's in the Freddy makeup because they used to do crap like that on daytime TV, and it's just this surreal movie as well. It's got almost a Lynchian dreamlike quality throughout that's really effective as well.
Well, and it also showcases Wes Craven's ability to understand kind of the juggernaut he created with Nightmare on Elm Street. The fact that he lost control over Freddy Krueger, never really had the rights to Freddy Krueger as he went, and lost control after the third one, and that's when Freddy Krueger became kind of the trickster. He became almost the hero of his own movies by like 4, 5, and 6, and here comes 7, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which, by the way, side note, I love that his name is in the title, Wes
Yeah.
Craven's New Nightmare. That's the full title. But here comes the 7th one, and it starts poking holes at its own juggernaut, like you said, with the Robert Englund scene where he shows up in character. Because I remember back in the day when Freddy Krueger was showing up on MTV to talk with the VJs and things like that. It's interesting that Wes Craven could step back enough to see kind of what this had become, and then almost make it its own horror film. This idea that not only is he wrote this movie, and in New Nightmare he's writing a movie that he loses control over, that starts to take over, and it's almost like this weird narrative about how he lost control over Freddy Krueger. And I think that's a great parallel to throw into it.
It actually recontextualizes the meaning of a dream monster,
Absolutely.
because he's no longer a dream monster in quite the same way. Now he's actually being born into the real world because he's an idea. It almost treats him like an infection.
Yeah, and I think that's great, particularly in the 90s. We had a lot of that, this lot of interesting, and I know that there's a lot of articles and people that believe that the 90s was this drought of horror, and there's actually a lot of good stuff in horror in the 90s.
Oh
You
yeah,
you just had to find it.
like In the Mouth of Madness, I'd say, is
Wh-
kind of in a similar vein.
Oh, you're actually going right to where I'm heading with this point. With In the Mouth of Madness, is that in the 90s you had a lot of these kind of contextual people. You had a movie like Candyman,
Mhm.
where Candyman existed as a rumor, and that was such a fascinating philosophical stance on like the slasher film, that was an interesting idea. And then literally only 5 months after Wes Craven's New Nightmare was the release of In the Mouth of Madness. So you had two iconic directors, John Carpenter on one side, Wes Craven on the other, both talking about a meta narrative about media and how it affects people and things like that. Do I think Wes Craven's New Nightmare is slightly better than In the Mouth of Madness? I do. I do. I would go that far and say that. But In the Mouth of Madness is one of John Carpenter's best, despite the fact that everyone loves to tout his early stuff. I think In the Mouth of Madness was like his last. I don't know if it was his last great film. There's a lot of films he did after that I enjoy, but I do really think that movie is highly underrated and touches a lot on that same meta narrative, well before Scream did.
Speaking of, you want to talk about the impossible episode of this show?
Yeah, trying to tackle John Carpenter. We almost have to break it up into decades. Let's talk
Right.
about the good, the bad, the weird, the wild of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Let's not talk about the ward, but like yeah, that's an impossible thing. But it's also really fascinating that you picked Wes Craven's New Nightmare for your good pick, because my pick for the good is going to be A Nightmare on Elm Street. I have to go with the classic.
Perfect.
The one that started this all. So
Absolutely.
the
So
reason
this Heather Langenkamp is Nancy.
is a Nancy, not Heather. Um, right, right. Nightmare on Elm Street. I should preface this by saying that this is going to be an interesting episode to talk about Wes Craven, because I don't, despite the fact that Wes Craven is considered an icon of the genre, and as he should be, but I really only believe that maybe 1 out of every 3 of his films is truly iconic.
Mm.
To go with that, for every great film he made a couple that were, maybe not as good or straight out bad. But when he was on point, he is on point. And
Mm-hmm.
Wes Craven's New Nightmare is an example of this. Nightmare on Elm Street is an example of this, because by the time Nightmare on Elm Street is coming out, the slasher film has already been dominating the box office for a few years at this point. Nightmare on Elm Street comes out late 1984.
Caylor specifically had no personality.
Yeah.
In these slasher films up to this point.
Right. And he comes out with this film that takes the slasher concept about a killer who's knocking off these teens in violent and bloody ways, and he embeds it with so much interesting ideas. This idea of the dream killer, as you mentioned before, that he turns the entire genre on its head, and it almost revitalizes the genre again. And he does this again and again throughout his career. But
well, because in a way it created the concept slasher, because at that point you have to contend with the fact that you're asleep. You are literally as defenseless as we can possibly be as a species.
Absolutely. And you have these teenagers who don't know how to deal with this. And we have this, these themes in this movie about, and like you said, eventually we'll tackle the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And there's lots to say about that franchise. It's one of my favorites. But
the psychosexual subtext alone is movie by movie too.
It's a roller coaster franchise, and I think it starts off on a really high note here. As you said, Heather Langenkamp, it starts as Nancy. She's kind of this young girl. I love that the film almost makes you believe that she's not the main character for the first chunk. It's that her friend would be the main character, and it slyly moves that to the side. It's a fantastic tour de force considering how early he was in his career. He had already had 2 huge horror hits by this time, but this one really redefined him as not only just being a horror filmmaker who could do shocking films, but he was a smart horror filmmaker. And of course, there's a couple of sequences in this movie that don't necessarily work as fluidly as you would want, but
fluid, one that still holds up great is Johnny Depp. An incredibly young Johnny Depp in his first role.
An incredibly young Johnny Depp who gets frapped in his bed. So
it's still great. Like, actually great.
Yeah, the friend who gets thrown up on the ceiling and she's being cut as like the boyfriend watches on the bed. Yep. I mean, there's so many iconic sequences in this over and over and over again that you get to see. I mean, I remember watching this as a little kid because, I grew up in households where, we watched all kinds of movies together as a family. But we would watch this, and I remember the first scene where you see Freddy Krueger and he's just like a shadow in the alleyway and his arms stretch out further. As an adult, you're like, oh, those arms, they're not the greatest special effects, but the idea of that is so terrifying, and Wes Craven shoots it in such a manner that it didn't matter if some of the special effects didn't work because of the dreamlike logic that he was using. And
there have rarely been as iconic a moment as the first time you see Freddy walking and scraping his claws on the wall of that furnace room.
Yeah, the boiler room, it's so good. And the use of the boiler room and the use of heat and how they keep him in shadow, and he always kind of looks a little bit gooey. And I just think it's fantastic. I like that in that film, they really don't build up Freddy to be a large figure. Not like Jason or Michael Myers or anything like that. He's kind of a smaller person.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like that he's like creep. It almost makes him creepier in a way. And I think that
victims, he wasn't quite the comedian he became in the later movies, obviously, but that brutal edge of taunting and teasing his victims was always there.
Well, right, and then it's revealed, and oh, I should have mentioned earlier that we do talk about spoilers in these episodes in case anyone doesn't want anything spoiled. But you know, in the end, you find out, like we talked about with Candyman or anything in the '90s, as those things, that Freddy Krueger existed on fear,
Mhm.
and that's how she beats him, is she ceases to fear him. And I think that's a really interesting idea, especially for a movie that's meant to be almost a message point for teenagers. This idea that, like, you can't fear everything in your life. It's the fear that'll kill you in the end. And I think that's a really interesting, particularly with the backstory, that the film was based a lot on bullying. That Fred Krueger was a bully that Wes Craven had known in school, and that idea of fearing the bully. And I think that's it all kind of coalesces into this great film that deserves to be on the list for the good, because not only is it one of his best, but it kicked off an entire franchise and it changed the slasher genre as we know it.
And as a diehard Phantasm fan, I must say, if you're gonna rip off any crazy horror ending, Phantasm's not a bad one to rip off.
Yeah. Oh, I can't wait for us to talk about Phantasm. I think if we ever do an episode on Phantasm, we should actually just do it where none of the sentences make sense. Like, all of our discussions are like just edited differently, so it feels like it's a dream logic.
We record that episode over the course of like 2 months, and I just like scramble it together.
Yeah, just like take 2 years, every 2 weeks we just record another 5-minute segment of that, so like everything is just feels like, by the time we finish it, we're as old as Reggie Bannister. That would be fantastic. I'm all
That's
about that.
hilarious.
Yeah, I'll become an ice cream man to record that too. I might as well. You become
Oh,
an Undertaker.
love it.
So good.
Oh, um, rolling right along, what would you call your bad?
All right. So, as I said, Wes Craven, for every good film, he's got a couple of them that probably aren't there. And I'm really curious to see what you have, because as much as we love Wes Craven, he's got some stinkers in there. And for me, the one I wanted to talk about today, I don't think is technically his worst film. I think he actually has some that are worse than this. But the reason I want to talk about this film is that I feel like this is a film where he didn't care. And I think that's a huge distinction. And the film I want to talk about is The Hills Have Eyes Part 2.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
know, right? Right? Let's talk
That
about this.
is, by the way, the original Hills Have Eyes 2.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
this is a franchise that's been going long enough that it has been remade in both the original and its sequel.
Yeah, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, which was, believe it or not, released after Nightmare on Elm Street, in theaters, which is weird to think about, even though I believe he filmed it before Nightmare on Elm Street. But there were so many issues with budgeting. It was, I feel like when you watch The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, that he had just come off. So, in a timeline of Wes Craven, for listeners out there who may not know exactly how the timeline goes, um, he did The Hills Have Eyes in 1977. It was a big success. It was kind of riding on the coattails of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in terms of kind of hitting that same niche group. He did a movie called Deadly Blessing in the meantime, and then he tried to jump into the big leagues. He tried to jump into a major kind of film, and that's when he did Swamp Thing. But Swamp Thing got so far away from him that he ended up doing The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, and in kind of a reactionary to that, to just kind of make some money. And it shows. It
Yeah.
shows in every frame of that movie, including the fact that the dog has a goddamn flashback in this movie, because they used so much footage from the original Hills Have Eyes to pad the timing, because they ran out of money and he just didn't give a shit anymore, that everybody has a flashback, including the goddamn dog.
Yeah, this movie's a crap pile. Like it's completely lazy. It's got less new footage than Silent Night, Deadly Night 2.
Oh, dude, comparing anything to Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 is either the best or worst thing that you can be comparing it to, depending
Yeah.
on how you feel about Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2. But the Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is just, it's a wild movie. And it's one of those movies that has, in recent years, started to get one of those cult followings where people are like, it's not that bad. You know, and enough so that even Arrow Video released kind of this really nice deluxe set on Blu-ray with a remastered version of the film. It's great because they also released a really deluxe version, nice version of the original Hills Have Eyes on Blu-ray. And they're kind of like a matching set. So, of course, because, you know, as you would know, I'm a franchise whore and I whore out for franchises. So I totally bought the Hills Have Eyes Part 2 deluxe set on Blu-ray because I just had to have it. Even though I hate this film, I hate it. Every time I watch it, I'm like, God, this movie has potential, but man, none of it makes sense. I mean, it's so silly. There's, you know, the fact that the whole movie is set up because they run out of gas due to daylight savings time is so stupid. Like everything in this movie just is really frustrating to me, and it feels like to me that, I mean, Wes Craven has done some bad movies that are, you know. But for the most part, I feel like he tries in a lot of his movies to do something, even if it doesn't work. For me, the reason The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is in the bad is because I really don't feel like he gave a shit, ultimately.
Although, I will say, no defense for the movie. It is absolutely terrible, but I'll always love Michael Berryman in anything, so.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give you that. And he's in this movie. And I guess there's some motorbikes.
Yeah.
Motorcycle racing. Yeah, that's a rough one. But that kind of wraps that up. So what's yours? I got to know, what's your choice for the bad?
So we are about to have ourselves a little sacred cow barbecue, my friend.
Hot takes galore. I like it.
I actually hate the movie The Last House on the Left.
Oh, another early one for him.
So, a movie that has literally always left a bad taste in my mouth. Wes Craven's debut feature, Last House on the Left, is a brutal, prototypical rape revenge thriller. The attacks and violence are brutal and shocking, even by modern standards. So why do I hate this movie so much? Tonal whiplash. You see, everything in this movie is dark, bleak, and horrifying until the police get involved. All of a sudden, the police sequences are this slapstick, sped up film, Keystone Cops styled, and it is a pace and complete mood killer for me. This movie to me is literally like intercutting Martyrs with Naked Gun 33 and a third, and it is completely off-putting to me.
Now, when you say Martyrs and Naked Gun 33 and a third, you're talking about two movies I love, Sean. I love both of those movies. How dare you incite them together?
That is not two great tastes that taste great together. That's like Vegemite on an Oreo, dude. Come on.
I feel like I'm going to gag just thinking about that. Ugh. Ugh. So I guess I don't hate this movie nearly as much as you do. I do think it's super bleak and dark, and it's very rough and edgy in a lot of ways. I feel like I understand what he was at least aiming for with the Keystone Cops.
I think I do too, and it was the 70s, and it's actually not wildly uncommon for this kind of movie in the 70s. And I'm even aware of that. But for a movie as regarded as it is, and here's where the movie hit its real roadblock for me personally, is when its remake is actually better.
Yeah, and I'm also on the same page with you on that. I do believe the remake is better than the original, and I don't know if it has anything to do with Wes Craven as much as they learned what they could fix from Wes Craven's, because it was technically his first film. We'll put that in quotes. It was his first film, and so super low budget. He does a lot of interesting things with what he has in there, but yeah, I think the remake just has the ability of hindsight to be able to say, yeah, they take out the silly cops and focus on this and give it a little bit of production value. And so I actually agree that the Last House on the Left remake is better than the original. So that's really interesting, though, that you would pick that for your bad. I mean, this
No,
is the guy
no,
that directed My Soul to Take.
I know it's a shocking one, and it's almost worse because it's so well regarded. So we take this movie I don't like, and then all of a sudden I have to hear all the time that, you know, in my precious genre of horror, it's held up as one of the Mount Rushmore horror films. And it makes it so much more frustrating for me personally. It's like a multiplier for how much I hate this movie.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And yeah, I can't really argue with you on your points. I guess I just don't hate it quite as much. I think that the serious stuff works for me. You know, it's a hard, I should also clarify, it's not a film that I enjoy to watch because I
Oh
don't
no.
think it's ever meant to be that. And so like if you do
It's a
enjoy,
commentary on violence, and it intended to be such, yeah.
yeah, it's a shock film, right? And it does not hesitate to take you to those dark places, and I think that's an interest, especially for come on, like again in quotes first film, but for a first film, man, he shot for the moon with in terms of like a bold, harsh film. So that's pretty interesting in its own regard. So all right, so that's yours for the bad, Last House on the Left. So I got to know then, where do you go in such a varied career for the weird?
Several young people's lives are deeply affected by an overbearing dark presence in the oft overlooked, if not fully forgotten, Craven classic, Music of the Heart. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Oh, I was like,
No,
oh
I'm
shit,
actually
what the
I'm,
fuck?
I'm
Like I
actually
was,
referring to
I've never even seen that movie. Oh shit.
nobody has.
No, but yeah, right. Yeah, because all of Wes Craven's fans are like, that movie exists.
Yeah.
Oh fuck.
No, it's seriously it's about a teacher fighting for the right to teach inner city students violin. I'm completely messing with you. No, I'm
It's that.
actually
I mean, come on, Music of the Heart does have Meryl Streep, right? Am I?
yeah.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah, she's a teacher. Um, no, I'm actually referring to the forgotten, flawed, entertaining, but insane Frankenstein's monster of a feature, Cursed. So,
Oh, I like it.
an insane cluster of rewrites, reshoots, recasts, studio interference, and rumored to have shot approximately, according to Judy Greer, 4 films worth of footage across 7 years. Craven often cited the experience as a learning experience. The lesson: never just do it for the money, which is why your initial quote struck interesting to me.
Yes. Oh man, Cursed. What a film. I didn't rewatch it in the last couple weeks as I wanted to. That was
It's
actually on my list.
it's actually not an overtly bad little werewolf movie, and I don't even like werewolf movies. It's silly and makes no goddamn sense, but I definitely like the team up of Williamson and Craven. I thought they did good work together.
Well, yeah, obviously they were coming off of the success of
Scream.
Scream, the Scream franchise, and everything like that. You know, and I'm gonna pull up my because I reviewed this film way back in the day over at Blood Brothers. I remember thinking that Cursed was actually pretty well directed and it had some great moments in it, but it just the writing, you could tell that it was a stitched together beast where nothing really made sense and the plot was just a fucking nightmare.
But you have a pretty decent performance from a very young Jesse Eisenberg. You have the always entertaining Christina Ricci. Did you know Skeet Ulrich exists in one of the cuts of this movie?
I've heard that there's a lot of people that exist in other cuts, like James Brolin and Robert Forster. I
Famous.
think there, yeah, and like Heather Langenkamp had a role in it originally. I had heard all kinds of, and it's at this point where like Cursed, I'm not sure what's real or not about Cursed because with how much shit that they had completely reshot, reshooting, taking out characters, adding in characters, restructuring this whole film that You literally could tell me that like the fucking Rock was in this movie, and I'd be half tempted to believe it because who knows what the hell this movie originally was supposed to be.
I'd be fascinated to see earlier cuts of this, and the editor does say they exist. They're never going to get released. It's, I mean, not going to happen. But editor apparently still has his copies of like at least 3 earlier cuts of the movie. I read an interview with him somewhere prepping for this episode.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I'm glad you picked this because this is a fascinating film to talk about in so many ways. Like you said, it's got some good stuff in it. I to this day I distinctly remember the scene where the werewolf flips off somebody, as, which is such a Wes Craven kind of weird horror comedy moment that he liked to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if this will, especially because it was Dimension Films, right? That did this one. So yeah, who fucking knows if we'll ever see it.
Did the shit out of this.
I think somebody should do a documentary on it though, or something where they could at least try to make sense of everything and try to verify things with
everything about the story of this movie is just fascinating and wrapped in Hollywood myth because like we kind of alluded to, but I mean, this is a movie that was wrapped and did reshoots so extensive that they rumor shot ostensibly 4 movies.
That's such insane.
Come back, so they had to cut and change entire roles, which led to more reshoots with the new actors, and it's crazy that this movie ever even came out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what it was. Now, you mentioned the editor had various copies of that because it wasn't the editor on this film Patrick Lussier, director of like My Bloody Valentine 3D. And director of like his most recent film was Trick. I'm pretty sure he was the editor on this. I'll have to look that up. I'm pretty sure he was the one that's the editor on this, and he is a horror fan. So my guess is he wouldn't lie about something like that if he was kind of the guy that was on this, because he got his career started as an editor.
Patrick Lussier, you're entirely correct.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I mean,
Drive Angry.
He did, yeah, he directed Drive Angry. He's done so many fun films. We should actually do him. That should be somebody we should do on Good Bad Weird Wild. Personally, because he did like all the Dracula 2000 movies for Dimension, so he was kind of a Dimension boy, in kind of the beginning.
I actually think Dracula 2000 is a pretty solid movie too.
It's kind of fun. I need to revisit that. I actually pulled that out the other day because I was thinking about.
It was on. It's on Amazon Prime. I actually watched it probably month ago, revisited that actually.
But I mean, but Patrick Lussier is really embedded in the horror community and stuff like that. So, if he's saying that he's got extra cuts, extra footage of this movie, he probably's got it. And so that's really interesting that, I'm pretty sure Dimension was bought out by somebody else and bought out by somebody else at this point. But, I'd be really curious to see. I wish that somebody would at least do some kind of a documentary or something on this, because it is a fascinating film and it definitely deserves to be in the weird. So
bearing that in mind, what would you call your weird?
So I actually heavily debated doing Cursed as my choice for the weird, simply because of how cool that story is, or how cursed that story is, if you will. But Baracha, Sean, Baracha. My choice for the weird is actually going to be Scream 4.
I'm glad we got to talk about one of these.
I'm going to take it that Scream is not on your choice for the Wild, or any of the Scream movies.
Have not touched on Scream proper. Yeah, this is a weird movie. So all the metatextual stuff we were talking about earlier, but just on this like whole different level. The intro to this movie alone is like 4 or 5 layers deep. This dude is playing 5th dimensional chess with this shit, but it's your choice, please, by all means.
Yeah, so Scream,
choice for the weird.
Right. Like we could talk about Scream, right? Because we talked about Scream a little bit as being a meta commentary on slasher films, on the current state of things. Also the controversial line about, horror movies don't create killers, they just make killers more creative, which is such a great line in that movie. And especially delivered by a deranged fucking Matthew Lillard.
The entire Jamie Foxx you gotta follow the rules scene is iconic. And that's kind of its only real metatextual level, is that you have a horror movie nerd stuck in a horror movie situation, which is instantly fascinating to all the horror movie nerds that go to see the movie.
Well, right, and it also creates this franchise, right? So you have Scream, which is this surprise success, right? And then you have Scream 2, which continues that meta commentary. You get the third one. Each one is diminishing returns in terms of quality, as far as I'm concerned.
It goes from having Drew Barrymore on the poster and having her be the top billed actress, and then murdering her in 3 minutes. That level of amazing shock. It goes from that to Jay and Silent Bob cameo.
Yeah.
Which
is its own weird commentary. I get it, and there's people who will defend not only the Scream movies, but like Scream 3 to the end of days and things like that. And I get it. I get why people like it. But I think the first Scream is a really good film on its own regard. So which makes Scream 4 really interesting, because it comes so long after Scream 3. It was originally announced, again, talk about cursed films, and talk about Kevin Williamson cursed films. He comes out and he says, we're going to start a new trilogy, and it's going to be, based on kind of like a modern horror films and looking at that. I remember seeing Scream 4 in theaters, and I was like, oh, you know what? I actually really liked Scream 4. I think it's probably the second best of the Scream franchise. I really like it that much in those regards. And as time has gone on, Scream 4 has only gotten better, as far as I'm concerned. Because, like we talked about before, when Wes Craven is on, he's on game. And he has this weird knack to be able to look at things that in both subtext that are happening around him that really resonate. And sometimes he's ahead of the curve. I think we saw this with New Nightmare. We saw this with the original Nightmare on Elm Street. We saw this with Scream. And I think he weirdly does it with Scream 4, because this is a movie about teenagers trying to gain popularity online by doing wild and crazy things, which isn't a new concept. We had Jackass at this point, but as time has gone on, that has become a stranger and stranger and stronger phenomenon with times. I mean, we have these fucking kids eating Tide Pods out there, that there's these weird things that go along, and I really like the idea.
In its own way, it's just that concept alone's almost spun off into its own subgenre of horror, because with things like what was the John Cho one?
Searching.
Yeah, Searching, and the Unfriended franchise, like,
yeah, and even Tragedy Girls, which is like that slasher where they decide to fake being the slasher killer to maintain their popularity online as detectives. That's also in quotes, detectives for this slasher killer. Tragedy Girls is fantastic, by the way. But Scream 4 kind of is a weirdly ahead of the curve in 2011 with this.
And speaking of. Just speaking of ahead of the curve, let me throw some names off at you. Got Kristen Bell, got Alison Brie, got Hayden Panettiere coming right off of Heroes. She was actually the biggest get in that. We got like Emma Roberts, Rory Culkin, like Adam Brody. Like, there's a really solid young cast of people who all broke out.
Yeah, I mean, even like Emma Roberts was on, American Horror Story and all these other films and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, this film is weirdly stacked, and like I said, I feel like it's actually gotten better with time, and I think that's why I have to choose it for the weird, because this was a movie that even at the time I remember liking it, but not necessarily loving it. I mean, it bombed at the box office, so there went that trilogy out the fucking window. Sorry, Kevin Williamson, but
although the 6-part multi-twist intro and the 3-part multi-twist ending, it's a lot. The movie is a lot.
It is a lot. And I'm not saying that it's a great film by any means, but I definitely wanted to choose it for the weird, because
it's a lot more fun. I would actually agree. I think it's the second best Scream film. I'm just saying, boy, this movie dumps a lot on your lap.
Well, and it's pretty obvious, especially watching it now. I don't remember at the time being aware that it was going to be the start of a trilogy, that was the intention. But
Oh, I don't
watching it.
think I knew that till you just said it, but it totally tracks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially when you think about it now. When I was rewatching the Scream franchise a couple years ago, as I'm watching it, I'm like, oh shit, this really does track that this was supposed to be the start of a trilogy. This idea of the online, uh, you know, not just like killers who are influenced by horror movies, but somebody who's doing it for not just for revenge, but doing it for a reason to be liked, to create an online persona that you can sell. I think that's such a fascinating idea, and I think Wes Craven was pretty. It's not a great film, but he had an idea there, and I think that
Let's,
had there been a trilogy.
he was ahead of his time, but let's never forget this was still predated a little bit by like Strangeland and like Fear.com. Remember that weird Stephen Dorff piece?
Oh, hey! I like Fear.com. It's a movie so embedded in its own timeline that it's great. It almost became like a timeless classic because it's so embedded in its timeline. Uh, but I digress. That's just getting off track at that point. But yeah, Scream 4. I'm gonna choose that for my weird, because I think it's a weird movie and I really enjoy it. And you know, again, rest in peace, Wes Craven. That was essentially his last film. After the box office failure of My Soul to Take right before that, and the box office failure of Scream 4, I think he just kind of had a hard time getting anything off the ground after that, which was kind of a shame because I do think Scream 4 has got a lot of interesting stuff in there, and I would have liked to see what he would have done else other than that.
Although, in society's favor, My Soul to Take was a piece of shit. That didn't
My
deserve.
Soul to Take was a piece of shit. So I know, and I think that was why, like, when I went into Scream 4, I was like, "Oh my god, did you guys see My Soul to Take? Fucking Wes Craven has lost it. He has lost." And then I came out pleasantly surprised with Scream 4. So
No, he went out swinging. He went out swinging.
and what
All
else
right.
swinging? So all right, so okay, so that was my weird. So we're on to the final round. I got an ace up my sleeve for this one, but I gotta know, what's your
All
choice
right.
for wild?
So, an underseen late career movie of Craven's that proves that a PG-13 rating is not a death knell for a horror film, featuring an excellent early performance by Cillian Murphy. Red Eye is
Oh, yeah. When you said Cillian Murphy, that's when it dawned on me what you're talking about. I haven't seen this movie in forever, so why Red Eye? That's a wild card choice.
so not only not only is Cillian Murphy great in it, but it's actually something he wanted. He read the script and he wanted this role so badly. He flew from his native England to Hollywood 2 days before his wedding to audition for it. Craven picked him because he said he really liked his eyes. He had great, crazy eyes. Not to take away from Rachel McAdams really giving her all to the point of being knocked cold by one of the stunts in the movies, unconscious for 30 full minutes, jumping right up and enthusiastic to shoot the scene again. It all points to why this kind of works for me. Everybody wants to be there, and this movie completely fires on all cylinders. It's actually more of a horror thriller, and it's about this hitman who gets on a plane with Rachel McAdams, and basically they've got killers on her father with the idea that since she's like the head of this major hotel, he wants her to change this diplomat's room to this room that's facing this other building where they got a sniper set up, or they're going to kill her father. And it's just that simple a setup, but it's this man kind of convincing her that her father's actually in danger, and then convincing her to kind of do this for him. And it's just this ever tightening screw, because they've basically got until this plane lands. And just everything about the setup, everything about how this film is shot, all of the acting is on point. This is truly one of Craven's best, and honestly something I considered for the good. Like, I just have a lifelong love affair with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, but it's why I'm glad we have a wild card slot, because I knew I wanted to talk about this movie specifically, because it is, on top of, I think, being some of his best work, especially in points of tone and tension, but it's also, as I said earlier, just very underseen. Like it's not a movie that makes a lot of lists at all.
And I think that's a lot of the problem with. We talked a little bit about beforehand about Wes Craven wanted to move out of the genres. He did a superhero movie for Christ's sakes, right, with Swamp Thing, right? So I mean, he always tried to move away from horror, and even when he did kind of horror fringe stuff, it never really audiences never really reacted to it. And I think that was the issue here with Red Eye, because you're absolutely right. I haven't seen this in years, but when I had seen it, I loved it. I thought it was great. I thought it was incredibly well directed, well acted, all that stuff. It was just, man, this is one of those movies, that just almost didn't exist after it came out. It kind of came out, went to the wind, and didn't exist anymore. And so, and you're absolutely right. It's a shame.
Oh,
It's a goddamn shame.
I would I would bet even money we're the first podcast to ever even talk about this movie in any capacity.
Let alone a positive capacity, because I'm sure people watch it and they were like, it's not a horror movie, put their disc on the counter and use it for a beer coaster. But it really does deserve to be talked about, because I think you're absolutely right. It's a phenomenal film. It just happens to be one that, especially kind of where it comes in his timeline.
Yeah, timing, because it's very late stage Craven too.
Yeah. It's a it comes right after Scream 3, which is generally panned, and then right after Cursed.
Yep.
And Cursed was such a fucking clusterfuck that Red Eye, I think people were like, and didn't it come out the same year as Cursed, because Cursed took so long to actually finally come out.
But I mean, on top of all that, like, they had a lot of unknowns. Rachel McAdams was, fairly, she was not quite established. People knew her name, but she wasn't quite there yet. And Cillian Murphy, I mean, made a pretty big splash with 28 Days Later, but that was about it. This is only his second or third kind of major role.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was there's a lot of interesting things about this movie. I just think it was a good movie that came out in a bad time in his career, in terms of actually getting somebody to care about it, right? And so it's definitely a bright spot in the latter part of his career, especially after like Scream 3, Cursed, and then right after this, 5 years after this, he does My Soul to Take, which we've already shit on quite aptly by this point.
Also,
but
if I may make special note, Cillian Murphy's killer character is named Jackson Ripner, and I love that.
I forgot about that. Oh, that is either the best or the worst thing ever. So,
all right.
Oh yeah, that's good stuff. Yeah, well, yeah, I'm glad you picked that. It's an interesting movie, and it totally deserves to be a wild card pick for somebody. And it deserves to be talked about, so that we can, maybe Scream Factory, somebody will get the rights to it and do it justice in a home video release to kind of bring it back. And as time goes on, movies from certain eras start to get reclaimed. The 2000s are now being reclaimed by fans. Maybe it's time for Red Eye to get reclaimed by the fans. Lead him to the charge. Lead him to the charge, Sean.
There's a I still remember in the credits it actually shows the blooper where Cillian Murphy slammed Rachel McAdams so hard she got knocked cold. It's amazing.
Tense stuff.
All right, so that is my wild card pick. What is yours? We've actually managed to have 4 completely separate choices each.
Yeah. Well, when he's got 33 credits to his name, I guess you're bound to do it. Like, unlike like Eli Roth, when we did that episode, we crossed over quite a bit. So my choice for wild card is potentially one of his silliest films, and it's also one of his greatest films, as far as I'm concerned. This is a movie from 1989, and it's a little film called Shocker.
Yes. Mitch Pledgy.
This movie, I literally just rewatched this last week because it's actually like, I remember growing up with this film and watching it over and over again. I love the movie. I love the comedy in this movie. I love how strange this fucking movie is. Every time I watch this movie, I'm like, none of this should work. As I'm watching it, I'm looking at this and I'm like, none of this script should work at all whatsoever. And yet, as I'm watching it, I'm like, God damn it, it does. All of this works together. It's an incredibly energetic film. I don't love the main guy in it who plays the football player who's, chasing down this killer who has become electricity. Saying that out loud is so much fun.
Murphy?
What was that?
Michael Murphy?
Yeah, don't love him, but everybody in this movie is on their A game. Mitch Pileggi for sure is on his A game. I love that they give him this limp that is only necessary when we need to understand which body he has transferred himself to.
Yeah.
But the scene where he transfers into the body of the little girl and she's like running through the park with that limp in her leg and she starts driving the tractor, the fucking construction vehicle. I mean, this movie, I laugh. This entire movie, this is one of the perfect examples of Wes Craven being able to combine his horror kind of persona with pitch black humor, and I think this movie is just the epitome of everything 80s that I love.
And this plot, I mean, this basic plot conceit has actually been ripped off a fair few times to varying effects from movies as bad as Jason Goes to Hell, as much as I personally don't think that's the worst Friday the 13th. But to movies as good as that Denzel flick, Fallen.
Yeah, Fallen. Fallen's a great
film.
John Goodman is so good in that. Yeah, I absolutely love Shocker.
It's a song, but boy, you have never been more creeped out by a Rolling Stones song.
Oh, absolutely. Fallen is great, but yeah, Shocker did it, and Shocker's just a phenomenal. I mean, by the time you get to the third act, where our hero sets up a video recording session, a live video recording session in a bedroom, so that way he can literally chase our killer through TV channels. And as the TV channels are changing, they're like fist fighting through all the different things, like whether it's like, all these old shows like Leave It to Beaver or like footage of the war or anything like that. They end up coming out of a TV in a family's room, like in our house, and the lady who's watching it is like, well, talk about live TV, like bringing it to you in your house. This movie is just phenomenal. I love every minute of this movie, and it also has one of the greatest film soundtracks of all time. Some of the greatest heavy metal artists of the late 80s, including like supergroups, the Dudes of Wrath, which was a supergroup that's on this soundtrack. This soundtrack is also one of the greatest things. I remember I still own the soundtrack on CD. I listen to it all the time. I think this film is aces all the way through. It's not a film for everybody because it's silly and it will challenge your logic.
Bonfire song, Sword and Stone.
Oh, so good. If we had the rights to it, we should just edit the rest of this episode with music from fucking Shocker. Also Megadeth doing the No More Mr. Nice Guy Alice Cooper cover, which is just incredibly aces. The music video for that, which is for the movie Shocker, is also really funny because Dave Mustaine is completely out of his fucking gourd in it. He's completely nonsensical. You can just tell, like, he showed up on set one day and just couldn't.
Bitch about Dave Mustaine's singing voice all you want. I will watch him mug in music videos all day.
So good.
If our listeners have never watched the Sweating Bullets music video, it is just Dave Mustaine kicking the crap out of himself in an insane asylum, and it is amazing.
Yeah, it's so good. Shocker represents everything I love in weird cinema in so many ways. But I mean, down to, like you mentioned, the killer's name in Red Eye. The killer's name in this is Horace Pinker, which is like one of the greatest serial killer names of all time, is Horace Pinker.
It's a good one.
It's so good. But I mean, Ted Raimi plays a character named Pac-Man. Going into names, Ted Raimi's in this movie for a short time. He plays a guy named Pac-Man. Are you fucking serious? This is great. This is everything I ever wanted. So That's why I got to give it the wild card has to go to Shocker. It's one of the strangest films he ever did because of its genre bending. But
I came to this movie from a weird angle too because I was a diehard X-Files fan, and like I do with anything I'm a huge fan of, I chase down, previous roles for a lot of the people. So this was the previous Mitch Pileggi role. That's why I was like, oh shit, Mitch Pileggi. And what's funny about it in retrospect to me is this is basically the plot of an episode of X-Files.
I like it. I also should point out that there is a sequence in this which has one of the greatest quotes of all time in a movie where Horace Pinker, because he becomes electricity by the second half of this movie and can zap from thing to thing, he zaps himself into a massage chair. And then when the hero goes to sit in it, he like grabs the hero and his line like as a chair. Like this is literally Mitch Pileggi as a serial killer named Horace Pinker, dressed like a goddamn recliner chair. And he gets it like he's like grabbing the hero and he says this line, he says, "This Barca Lounger's gonna kick your ass, boy," which might be one of the greatest bad lines of all time. But so good.
That and him possessing the little girl and trying to start the bulldozer and being like, come on, you fuck, move.
This movie is just like one great one-liner after another. It's so good. And I know we talked about good, bad, weird. This is my wild card pick. But if there's any movie I recommend to anybody more than anything we've ever talked about in this episode, it is fucking Shocker. You have to see Shocker. It's an incredible piece of 1980s genre cinema.
Love it.
Love it.
And I think that about wraps up the career of Wes Craven, which, boy, we actually spread pretty much across the whole thing. We did pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, we covered most of the major basics here, so I'm pretty proud of what we kind of came up with. I mean, I do find it interesting that we missed out on some things. I could have sworn you were going to put Swamp Thing on there, so I'm a little bit shocked that you didn't.
Yeah, and speaking of connections to things I love, like I'm a huge Ray Wise fan anyway, and he's only in about 20 minutes of Swamp Thing, but he's really good in those 20 minutes.
Yeah, for sure. Swamp Thing's a lot of fun. So I'm a little bit shocked you didn't do that. I'm also a little bit shocked that neither one of us picked People Under the Stairs.
We certainly wanted to reference it in the intro. And speaking of Twin Peaks connections, man, Wes Craven must have been a Twin Peaks fan. Because Ray Wise and then both they're not, boy, would you call them killers? Kidnappers, I guess.
And killers, I guess.
Also, yeah.
Oh man, yeah, that's a great movie. So
when Big Ed comes out in the frickin' full-on gimp gear,
with a shotgun, classic stuff. And that's one of those movies that, like I said, when Wes Craven was ahead of the curve, or when he was on his A game, he was on it. People Under the Stairs is another one of those movies that's really
way ahead of the curve on that one for sure.
Yeah.
And we definitely missed a fair few stinkers on this one too. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, you did mention Music of the Heart, so I guess we can call it good. So fuck, that was good. That was a good joke. All right, so I guess that's it for our episode on Wes Craven. For everyone out there, I hope you enjoyed listening to us rant and ramble about Wes Craven and as an iconic horror director. Maybe one time we'll do writer or producer for him too, because I think that would be really interesting to kind of talk about that. I mean,
right.
Yeah, for sure. If you guys out there, if you like what you're listening to, please don't forget, if you like the show, check out our back catalog. We're starting to get a nice, decent one going. You can go over to Anchor. Our page on Anchor is going to have a lot of our back catalog. You can also find us on most places where you can listen to your podcasts, Google, Spotify, anywhere else where you listen to all your goddamn podcasts. That's where you're going to be able to find us.
If someone wants to reach out to us, if you're just super pissed we didn't touch on Vampire in Brooklyn.
I'm pissed we didn't. Justice for Eddie Murphy, Sean. Justice for Eddie Murphy. In a year where he got snubs on the Oscar nominations.
Don't even get me started.
He should have won them all for Vampire in Brooklyn. All of them. Greatest film ever made. Oscar. Here's an Oscar for you.
So if you want to read us the riot act for missing the classic Vampire in Brooklyn, where can they reach us, Matt?
Right. You can always find us at Twitter. That's at our handle nffpod. You can find us at facebook.no franchise fatigue. And while you're at it, you can also read a lot of our stuff, our written stuff. Sean and I both write at Blood Brothers Film Reviews. That's Blood Brothers Film Reviews at .blogspot.com. And of course, if you ever want to chat with me, I'm happy to chat with you guys. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram under the handle at the Movie Mat. Which is just fun to say. I had somebody refer to me on a post in Facebook the other day as the Movie Mat, and I thought that was the funniest thing. I must have made it to the big leagues now because somebody actually referred to me as my Twitter handle. So you never know. You never know where you're going to be in life.
The famous Movie Mat quoted on the cover of Nezha.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Yeah, my review for Nitsa just got my quote. Got a pull quote on the cover art of Nitsa for the new Blu-ray release for an animated Chinese film of all things. So
wonderful animated Chinese.
It is a great one, and they just announced the sequel. So thank you for all the listeners out there for listening to us. Once again, we are No Franchise Fatigue. This is our episode on The Good, the Bad, the Weird, the Wild for Wes Craven. Please check us out. Check out our back catalog, also on Good, Bad, Weird, Wild. And also you can check out our mothership episodes, which is called No Franchise Fatigue, where we analyze franchises. Until then, check us out. Until our next episode, please stay frosty, guys. Stay frosty. And stay craving some more movies.
There you go.
No, I got the pun in. You son of a bitch. Now cut the recording.